start recording. And I want to just really briefly speak to kind of where a lot of the work that comes. We're really gratified to have the collaboration of different organizations that have helped us a lot in our work for clean air. So our organization, Neighbors for Clean Air, is fairly small, and we small staff of working with really incredible partners. Green Energy Institute, you're going to hear later from Amy Schlesser from the Green Energy Institute, Northwest Environmental Defense Center, and our first speaker tonight is Dr. Linda George from Portland State University, and she runs what's called the STAR Lab, and she's done amazing work, and the collaboration and partnership with Portland State University has been really phenomenal to start to create the evidence that we've needed to really understand and unpack the air pollution issues in our region. And so I'm really excited. A few years ago, Department of Environmental Quality was awarded a fairly significant grant from US EPA, $650,000 to study the original Portland air toxic solutions diesel emissions inventory and have a better understanding of that. And Dr. George is going to be able to present to us tonight some of the initial work. It's sort of a tease, I have to say, because later in this year, we really want to work harder to do some community engagement around the information that's coming out of this study. But I thought with 3 really important diesel bills, I thought it was a great opportunity for Dr. George to be able to share some of the initial findings from that study. So we are going to then have Representative Karin Power join us at 4:20, and then we're going to have the three of us go through the actual bills that are part of the legislative session this session. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I'm very honored to be able to present my partner and friend, Dr. Linda George.
I think Linda's on mute, and hopefully she. Oh, there we go.
Okay. After all the Zooming I've done this year, you'd think I'd get this down, but nope. Okay, so I am, as Mary mentioned, thank you, Mary, going to be talking about some of the work that we've done with this EPA grant. And I just wanted to make sure you understood that we're doing this in collaboration with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and the program manager there is Meenakshi Rao. And my collaborators on this project are Julie Fry at Reed College and Vivek Chandas, also at Portland State. And most of all of the work really that I'm going to be showing you has been done by graduate students, particularly Kristen Sarl, Lindsay Boyle, and Andrew Rogers. I just get to talk about it. So I want to just start by talking about what diesel exhaust is. Some of you, I mean, I know most of you have seen this before, but I just want to get us all on the same page. So diesel exhaust, when you talk about diesel exhaust, is a very complex mixture of various gases and particles. And almost all of it is not unique to diesel. So it's a complicated thing to identify as just diesel exhaust. Many of these things come from multiple sources. So anytime fossil fuel is burned, you get carbon dioxide and water primarily, and then you get some pollutants. And some of those pollutants are very toxic. So for diesel, the toxicity is associated primarily with the particles that are generated from diesel exhaust. And part of the toxicity has to do with the size of the particles. They're very small, and they're so sub micron down to tens of nanometers in size, and that allows those particles to even pass into the blood-brain barrier, through the lungs, into the bloodstream, and into the brain. So that relates to some of the toxicity of diesel exhaust. In addition, because of the way the particles are formed in the exhaust system, you also have some condensed gases that deposit onto the surface of the particles. And some of those gases are highly toxic as well. So basically you have a very effective drug delivery system with these diesel particles. And so this is a cartoonish version of a diesel particle. So it's kind of, I've talked about it as being kind of a toxic cannonball. And the thing that I want to use this picture for is to point out the black carbon core of this particle, because that's going to relate to how we try and make a measurement of diesel particulate matter related to that, because there's no one thing that's called diesel exhaust. And so we target that particle, that dark carbon particle, as a way to measure it. So the toxicity of diesel particulate matter has been studied by many groups around the world, including the World Health Organization, and it's just generally agreed that it's carcinogenic. But the level to which it's carcinogenic is still under some debate, and that's largely due to the complexity of the nature of diesel exhaust. It's hard to nail down, exposure. So, but Oregon has landed on a number of 0.1 micrograms per cubic meter for a benchmark, or a cancer benchmark. But California has landed on a number that's 33 times lower. So there's quite a variation there in terms of what different groups think about its toxicity. But nevertheless, it's considered a toxic substance. And because diesel is so prevalent in Portland's landscape, there's a lot of diesel activity, especially related to freight and construction. DEQ embarked on modeling the level of diesel particulate matter in the Portland area. And you've all probably seen this map. It's kind of distressing map. But so the color, the levels of redness relate to the levels of diesel particulate matter modeled by DEQ, projected into 2017. And just to remind you that the cancer benchmark is 0.1 microgram. So you can see on this map that everywhere it's above 0.1, but you see quite a bit of spatial variation and some really significant hotspots in this landscape. So the focus of our project is really to improve this model. And before I talk about what we've been doing, I want to kind of do a little bit of a basic primer on what modeling is. So this model output obviously is the concentration of diesel particulate matter, and it's being predicted for every grid point on this space. And for DEQ's model, it was averaged over a year. So it's an annual averaged diesel particulate matter concentration for every grid point over a year. And one of the things that we are proposing to do in our model is to do it by month, because I think there's seasonal variations in the concentration of these particulate matter that are important to take into account. But what goes into a model? So the model has to take into account all the different sources of emissions that are producing the diesel particulate matter in this case. So, and in this, for diesel particulate matter, there's a huge variety of sources. So it comes from trucks, from freight trucks and the Amazon trucks and the milk trucks, industry, shipping, construction, trains, recreational vehicles, all sorts of things. And so a modeler has to be able to predict the emission levels from all those different sources for every grid point, for every point in time. So usually at an hourly basis across a year. So for modelers, generally that is the weakest point, is really being able to get access to that information for every space and point. So because of the toxicity of this pollutant and its importance in this area, DEQ really was seeking out help in trying to improve this model. So just to give you an overview of our project, the first thing that we are working on or been working on is trying to get a handle on the emissions of some particular sources that DEQ identified as where there's some high levels of uncertainty. So that's rail, shipping, distribution centers, and construction. And that was to be fed into a new model for diesel particulate matter for the region. And then we are doing community monitoring in 2 communities. And that serves 2 purposes. One is to explore the exposure of those 2 communities to diesel particulate matter, but also allows us to provide some validation of the model. So some ground truthing of the model with some actual data. And then once we have the model, we wanted to develop a way to do what if scenarios. So what if some of this legislation passes? How will that affect the diesel particulate matter levels in the region? And then all of this is supposed to be, we are hoping to, as Mary mentioned, bring all this information to community workshops that we hope to present in the towards the end of the year. And NCA will be taking the lead in developing those workshops for us. But today I'm just going to be talking about the source testing and the community monitoring and how they relate to our improvement of the model. So as I mentioned, the areas of the model that DEQ identify are where there was a lot of uncertainty was rail, marine shipping, distribution centers, and construction. And what is it about these emissions? So we're trying to get at the emission rates of these sectors. And what goes into these emission rates are how often these sources are active. So that's the activity rate. So how many hours a day do they operate? What part of the year do they operate? So that's the activity rate. And when they're operating, how much do they emit? So that's the emission factor. So how much diesel PM is emitted per kilogram of fuel that's used. So that's the emission factor. So that gives us our emission rate. So both the activity rate and the emission factor have a lot of uncertainties, and we're trying to do better on both those components here. So our first target in trying to improve the emission rate was trains, the rail sector. So how do we go about trying to improve the emission rate? So one is doing a lot of research on how often trains run and how much load they have and all those things. And that's very hard data to come by because rail lines are notoriously secretive about this information. But Kirsten was very clever in talking to aficionados of rail. They know a lot more than one would think. There's a club apparently where people talk about this stuff. But the other ways, the other thing that we worked on was the emission rate. So how much is a train putting out? So that involved, so here train is going underneath a bridge. So we set up equipment on a bridge and had a tube going down, and we were actually literally measuring the emissions out of the plumes of the train. So from that, so we had a bunch of equipment sitting in this bicycle carrier, and we were measuring many, and I say we is the royal we, is really the graduate students, making a lot of measurements of train plumes and getting fumigated at the same time to try to get a sense of these emission rates. So there's quite a variation based on the companies that operate in the area, as you can see. And how that's important is that these companies travel in different parts of the city. So what we're going to be able to do in our model is make a spatial variation of the rail emission rates based on where these trains operate. So that's one of the things, and update the emission rates anyhow. But one of the interesting things is Union Pacific has a lower emission rate, and that's because it operates in California. And California has very strict controls on even rail emission rates. The next piece is, can you give me a 5 minutes up? Am I 5 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to jump then to community monitoring. So community monitoring, so we had to choose 2 sites in the Portland metro area to monitor. And we did that based on looking at the DQ model, some NO2 data, social metrics like minority, low income, number of children, renters, and then population density. So based on that, we looked at this map, and where it's redder is more vulnerable populations. We chose Cully and J District in collaboration with DQ. And so we set up monitors in Cully and Jade, and we compared, I'm going to show you data compared to Southeast Lafayette, which is DQ's reference urban site. And we used an instrument, I'm going to just show you data from an instrument called an atherometer that allows us, I'm not going into detail, but it allows us to look at fossil fuel carbon and also biomass burning carbon. So we can see 2 different types of carbon with this on our particulate matter with this instrument. So this is our reference site. This is Southeast Lafayette. So the red is fossil fuel. So mostly diesel particulate matter and biomass. So you can see that the traffic bump from fossil fuel at Southeast Lafayette, and you can see the biomass burning signal here. What's more interesting is to look at the annual data. So you can see the biomass burning peaks in the winter months. So that's when people are burning wood, but the fossil fuel is going on all year round. So just to keep in mind, the fossil fuel level is about 0.3 micrograms per cubic meter. The standard is 0.1, or the benchmark is 0.1. And just let's look at Cully. Cully, it's 0.6 to 0.8. And then Jade is more or less 0.25, 0.3 is at the highest. But I just want to do a caveat that we're operating in pandemic, so we're not sure if we don't think that's necessarily representative. So since I have to conclude, I'm just going to give you the bottom line. All 3 sites are above the levels, the cancer benchmark. Cully neighborhood so far is 50% higher than the reference site. Both Cully and Jade show a strong influence of traffic-related fossil fuel, and that we're working more on that. And then biomass carbon is a significant contributor all in the wintertime. So those are things we've learned so far. And all I can show you in this short presentation. I just also want to emphasize that we were operating under, we were supposed to do all this monitoring this past year. We tried to do the best we could, but we were really constrained with the pandemic. So our data has that caveat, and to the extent possible, next year, hopefully we'll be free of all the restrictions and we can do a little bit more monitoring, kind of going back to some of these neighborhoods, but we did what we can for now. So that's it.
So Linda, thank you so much. And I want to tell people, if they have questions, please put them in the chat. Linda can stay to the end of the presentation, and when we're finished for a little bit, and we will otherwise make sure she gets questions, and we'll try and get back to you. I'm very thrilled, and I know that she's on a very tight schedule, so I'm really thrilled to introduce Representative Karen Power, who has joined us now as she rushed back from Salem and trying to fit us in. So I want to give her a chance to join us and speak to us. But current Representative Power was the champion of, and the reason we got a diesel bill passed in 2019. And that was not a small feat. We became only the second state in the country to have actually any diesel standards for on-road engines. So it was not, and it was 2 decades of obstinance and no progress in terms of legislative action on this issue. So the breakthrough that her effort took and the amazing work that she did for us just demonstrates the difference when you have people who have both the knowledge, the understanding of these complex things, and the passion to do the right thing. And so I'm really thrilled, really enjoyed getting to know her better through that. And I'm jealous of all of you who she represents. So thank you very much, Representative Power, for joining us, and welcome you to tell us a little bit about what's on your agenda for this session.
Thanks, Mary. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. If I haven't met you before, my name is Karen Power. I represent House District 41. So I have parts of Southeast Portland, Milwaukee, and Oak Grove. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This year has thrown us for quite a loop in legislating remotely. And whereas I was previously the chair of the House Energy and the Environment Committee, I have a slate of new responsibilities this year that have opened up, I think, some new ways to engage in this material with you all. That's been pretty fun. And I know you're going to hear from my senior policy advisor, Kevin Downing, later. So legislating in a pandemic is surprisingly harder, I think, than even we had realized coming into this session. Not even factoring in the ice storm and having to reschedule things. So where we are, we're a couple weeks out from our work session deadline, where all the bills that have currently been filed have to be posted for a work session. We lost a little bit of time at the beginning due to political violence, the Capitol, and the shutdown. Then we lost a little bit of time due to the ice storm and people losing power outages and rescheduling bills because we couldn't hold committee hearings or people were unavailable to come and speak to their bills. That said, I think it's a testament to the diversification of people who have been championing this work at the local level, because I am far from being the only legislator this year to be bringing bills or working on policies to reduce diesel pollution and tackle local air contamination. So I want to acknowledge that Representative Nose continues to work on funding long-term phase outs or funding work to promote cleaner vehicles. He had served, I'm sure, with some of you on the interim task force on reducing diesel. And that has manifested in House Bill 2674, which I know is up in Energy and the Environment this week. We just had a hearing on House Bill 2479, which is a bill I brought in partnership with Kevin this year to have DEQ begin to factor in the volume and emissions of black carbon and begin to have to account for that to the legislature. And then that way it doesn't just live in any one legislator's portfolio. It'll be something that becomes part of our regular work and interaction with the state agencies. So I also want to acknowledge that my new colleague, Rep. Maxine Dexter, has been helping to champion House Bill 2814. She and I were just on the floor, spatially distanced today, talking about that one as well. And it's wonderful having some new public health colleagues who are able to articulate the intersections of public health and environmental justice. And it's really we've got quite a team of people who care about this now. It is, you know, I remember this moment sitting in the room with Mary in 2019 as we were really close to getting to agreement on phasing out dirty diesel engines from the Tri-County area. And that moment where you can sit with tough issues with people who oppose them and you just let that uncomfortable feeling percolate until everybody goes, all right, fine, like pencils down, we're ready to agree to something. That's what we don't have in this sort of virtual session right now. So it is, I feel like constantly we're playing a game of telephone to check in with each other and find out where bills are this session, because we don't have those hallway moments or those lunchtime moments to connect. But nonetheless, this is something I think a number of us know is out there and are tracking despite being on some bills, and we're all kind of co-shouldering the work at this juncture in session. So my learnings over the last couple of years, I think, inform that this work can't just live in any one legislator's. I helped to pass the diesel bill in 2019, but that was thanks to Senator Denborough's work for several sessions preceding that. So I picked up, ran with it, carried it as far as I could. Rep. Gnosis picked it up, dug into the task force, and then we have new colleagues coming in to help expand the work, which I'm sure is driving opponents nuts because they're, you know, you can't just play whack-a-mole with one legislator's bill when there's like 4 or 5 of them in different locations, and they're all working with different groups of people in different committees. So I want to also just flag for you a bill that I dropped today or it was first read today. So today is the first day. It's in the OLIS system, and it's 3305. And Kevin, if you felt like expounding or touching on it later during your sort of general remarks, you know, the technical aspects of how this would phase in, I think, a little bit more than I do. But to me, the thing I learned over the last couple of years is the folks who own those older equipment pieces on road and off road, it's not like they enjoy being really close to large amounts of diesel pollution either. They are just often costly and easy to maintain equipment, especially the older ones. It's not like they wake up in the morning and are excited about contributing to global climate change or local air pollution, but there really isn't an alternative for them. As a state, we haven't prioritized funding to help transition that equipment. And they're kind of at the whims of greater market forces and the entrenched oil and gas industry that's perpetuating, you know, the kind of status quo around non-renewable fuel sources. So I have, at the request of Titan Freight, which is a trucking company that has worked to transition their fleet to renewable diesel, I've dropped a bill 3305, which would transition our state to 100% renewable diesel by a date certain, and therefore help to, in the near term, reduce climate pollution and clean up local air quality. I know that renewable diesel is not a perfect solution either, but it is the kind of immediate drag and drop fuel replacement that is currently available and could help with near term carbon pollution. So it's a late drop. We'll see. We're getting very close to a work session deadline, but it should be heading to joint transportation, which isn't subject to those same early deadlines. So I want to note that a lot of the work that you all are championing helps promote local workforce development, helps promote local jobs, and really has that immediate health impact that we're seeking as we're fighting climate change more broadly. So I think both studying, creating inventories, making a plan to help fund and use our regulatory tools where we can, all of these efforts in concert together help to paint the picture of the future where we want to go as a region, as a state. And I'm really excited to be doing this work with so many new great champions and our partners out in the community like you. So thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Power. I understand that you have some place to jump to. So if folks have questions, maybe they could contact your office or.
I've got like 5 minutes. Okay.
If anybody had any questions, please put them in chat. I don't know if Kristen and Tori already flagged some questions for you. But I agree, it's really been exciting, if not a little frenetic. And no pity party from you, I know, but because, we have 3 bills we really care about. There are 3 different legislators. It's great to have this many people this interested championing the work. So, Alicia, I see you asking about the chance if we could fund electric trucks. Is that for Rep Power?
Sorry, yes, it is. Sorry, I typed that so quickly trying to get in under the line, but thank you so much for your work, Representative Power. Yes, I was just wondering about if there, I know that these amazing electric semis are on their way. Is there any chance we could just cut to the chase and try to fund those?
I think, the technology it exists. So it's just a matter of being able to scale it, get infrastructure to charge it, and how far these electric trucks can move. To be honest, I love all of the options out there. And I don't know if the private sector is ready for government to weigh in on any one particular solution. Clean hydrogen, which I'll distinguish from non-renewable source hydrogen, could also be an option and can pull heavier trucks. The innovation around batteries and electric trucks continues to amaze me. I think for this session, we're pretty focused on climbing out of the pandemic in the most equitable way possible. But I continue to talk to some of the folks I met through our cap and trade work at the national level about where next federal investments could come. It's not merely enough to just reinstate mile per gallon goals and undo some of the damage from the Trump administration, but the federal government's sort of uniquely in a position where, in climbing back out of the pandemic, they're not limited by the balanced budget requirements that we are at the state level. And I'm hopeful in the next transportation package, they'll be deploying more resources for electrification and doing some more robust funding of the national institutes that do renewable-based energy and innovative work. Our government used to fund breakthrough technologies and still does, just not to the degree that I think is keeping pace with other countries, but that doesn't mean we couldn't catch up too.
Thank you.
It looks like there's a couple other questions, one from Emily Herbert, just asking about the costs of renewable diesel. Do you happen to know the answer to that, Representative Power? If renewable diesel is more expensive than regular diesel?
It's not with the federal subsidies. As Kevin, feel free to correct me, but I think the business case for it is it's equivalent, if not better.
Does Kevin have anything else?
No, well, she's right. It's right now you can buy it at the same price as petroleum diesel.
Great. It looks like we have another detailed question, but Representative Power, again, we want to respect your time. I don't know if you can see that question.
The one about filtering requirements?
No, there's one that talks about the various sources of diesel. So it's a fairly detailed question.
I think we probably don't have time for her to answer that question, but Diana's question about filtering requirements maybe is a little faster that you were referring to.
Diana, talk to me about specifically, I just want to make sure I'm speaking to what filtering requirements they've adopted that we've not. They've also been spending a lot more money than we have. So they're ahead of us both in requiring technology and then adopting it.
Hi, thank you for all the work you're doing in this area. It's my understanding, I may be incorrect, that that a lot of the trucks going up the freeway from California to Washington have filtration on their diesel engines that bring their particulate level way down, but trucks that are internal to Oregon don't have the same requirements. And I'm just wondering, how do we get legislative changes, or was it not legislative changes in California that made those requirements?
Mary, do you want to field that one? Because that was part of our Tri-County work in 2019.
Yeah, Diana, thank you for the question, and thank you, Representative Power. I mean, that's exactly what HB 2007 addressed, was particularly in the Portland metro region that any of the trucks registered, heavy and medium duty trucks at a time certain, there's a phase-in period, would have to meet the stricter standards, which are, and because California did regulate those, they do have very strong standards for those. And, but, that doesn't get at all of the problem, and the diesel particulate emissions problem in the Portland metro region is significantly, that's about 15% of it, is the on-road heavy medium duty trucks. And so we were able successfully with the legislature to get restrictions and new standards in place, but we are still working. We don't have that in place for the non-road equipment. And that's what the bulk of diesel emissions comes from non-road. And California also has standards in that there are some issues, and I think Amy's going to address that a little bit later as we talk about why the HB 2814 indirect source rule is such a big opportunity for us to get around some of the preemptions and the problems we have with non-road engines. But I think we'll transition. Rep Power, well, thank you for your time, and really mostly for all of your work and your leadership. Really appreciate it. And we will do everything we can to also help 3305, because I think that sounds like, I do think that's very promising in the short term. So thank you for that work and that creativity. So thank you. So the next part of our agenda is to go through in a little bit more detail the three bills, and talk to, so that folks have an understanding of what we're championing in the state legislature. We're calling it our 2021 diesel legislative agenda. I think we'll start with Kevin Downing to talk about the black carbon bill that Rep Power talked about. It's HB 2479. It did have a public hearing yesterday, but there will still be opportunities to help move this forward. And then we have Amy Schlesser to talk about 2814, and I'll finish off with the last bill. So thank you, Kevin, for joining us.
Great, thanks for having me. So I just wanted to give some background about black carbon, because there's been a lot of talk about it. And especially even at the hearing yesterday, there was some confusion about actually what the extent of it is. Because again, we tend to think of climate change only in terms of gases, and there's more to it than gas. There's particles too. This is actually the first analysis. I point out that actually in 1896 was the first theorized about the influence of carbon dioxide on warming the climate. And it only was until about 2001 here with this study by Jim Hansen and others that identified particles as actually being also significant contributors as well. So this is a graphic that shows climate forcing. So the red bars are all those elements that are contributing to warming the planet. CO2 on the left here, and then CH4 is methane, CFC is nitrous oxide, and then we have black carbon, which in this analysis was posed as the second largest influence on climate change. And we had Dr. Drew Shindell from Duke University, who has been heavily involved in this work at the international level, actually said that it's really the third largest influence. So the science is evolving on this. And I also like to point out too, this other part here, the reflective aerosols, and we'll get into that a little bit more, because this actually, black carbon is a much more complex form of atmospheric science than what we're used to around CO2, which is actually pretty simple. And part of my concern about having this bill in place is that we tend to we have adopted a fairly simplistic perspective on how the atmosphere actually works when it's actually much more complex, and that we are leaving opportunities for improvements in terms of maintaining temperature behind if we're not paying attention to the complexities. Because the climate doesn't care, it's simply reacting in its chemical and physical nature to the influence of all of these climate forcers. which is actually, I'm trying to incorporate that into my language instead of describing it as greenhouse gases, because not everything is a gas that influences climate. The terminology is climate forcing, but you'll see me falling into the old language as well. So black carbon comes from a variety of sources. You can see them outlined down here, both from natural sources, as it were, as well as anthropogenic sources from industrial activity, as well as from people simply heating for food using fires. And it has an impact in terms of cloud formation, as well as simply being the blackness of it, of course, reflecting infrared heat back to the surface. It also deposits on snow, so there's a surface warming element there, accelerating snow melt as well. There's differences in impacting cloud formation, that actually there's a cooling effect sometimes, as well as a warming effect in others, and that's still being evaluated. But the other point to make here on this slide as well is, again, to talk about the co-emitted gases and aerosols. On the one hand, carbon dioxide is fairly straightforward. It's 19 pounds of carbon dioxide emitted from every gallon of fuel, gasoline burned. It's 22 pounds of carbon dioxide emitted from every, gallon of diesel fuel combusted. But and that's pretty straightforward. But with black carbon, the impact on climate really is a function of the nature of the fire, the nature of the combustion process as well, and there are co-emitted gases and aerosols that altogether from that source have potentially a variable impact on climate. So it's not necessarily true to say that all black carbon sources are bad. Some black carbon sources are worse than others. And the other thing about black carbon is the location matters as well. Carbon dioxide is described as a well-mixed stable gas in the atmosphere. We'll get to the stable part, but well-mixed means that the carbon dioxide that we have in the atmosphere around us right now is from multiple sources around the entire globe. But the black carbon impacts that we experience here in Oregon are more likely to be locally sourced. They're more black carbon is a regional, locally produced pollutant. Although actually there's deposition of black carbon in the Arctic, which there are no industrial sources, of course, in the Arctic. So it's actually theorized as coming from all those all that commercial, industrial, people living activity above 40 degrees north, which is about where Redding, California is. So you can see that the entire state of Oregon has the potential to contribute black carbon to warming issues, where it deposits on the snow, melts the snow, and then refuels the darker permafrost and starts melting that. And then there's a cascade of issues with methane release. The other part about black carbon is actually its residence time in the atmosphere. So this is a graphic that shows if you release a ton of black carbon over a year's time, you have radiative forcing. It's much more effective at contributing to climate change, on the order of about 2,500 times more per unit of mass. So same gram of black carbon is going to be 25 times more potent for climate forcing than is CO2. But the moment that you stop emitting black carbon, the impact drops away. So its residence time in the atmosphere is on the order of days to weeks. Whereas with CO2, you can see that the impact accelerates, increases over that year's time of that releasing that ton of CO2. But it's, as I said, it's a very stable gas. And so that ultimately to remove that impact from that molecule of carbon dioxide will take in a carbon cycle anywhere from likely to 50 to 100, much less to 1,000 years or more. So this is something that we really have to deal with over the long term. And to make it clear in this is not taking away any focus from reducing CO2 emissions. We absolutely need to do that. But we're at a point now where we need to incorporate other strategies as well. This was brought forth in this study that was done, actually chaired by Dr. Schindel at the United Nations, where they were looking at what it would take to the effective relative basket of measures that would take to keep the expected temperature increase below 2 degrees C, which is that dark orange color on the top. So you can see here this purple line, see if I can get this to go here. The purple line here is if we just kept on going the same we are. This is where we projected temperature increase by 2060. If we did just CO2 measures, we could see that we're bending the curve down. But again, because our starting point is so late, we are not going to be able to hold it below 2 degrees C, relying solely on CO2 measures. If we were looking at methane and black carbon measures, both of which are short-term climate forcers, we can see we got early benefits from that effort. But of course, It's not, because those are not the major contributors to climate change. You can see that that benefit wears over time. And so we still end up at the same place. What's necessary is to do this basket of strategies that addresses CO2, methane, and black carbon. So this also brings it home to me as well. This was a study I came across from geography students at the University of Hawaii, where they looked at this projected timing of climate departure from recent variability. And I love scientists. You know, they describe this. What is climate departure? And this is what they described it in the papers as an index of the year, you know, when the projected mean climate of a given location moves to a state continuously outside the bounds of historic variability. What the heck does that mean? Really, what it means is that the coldest average temperatures we'll see in the future will be hotter than the warmest average temperatures that have been seen since our great-great-grandparents were alive. This moves me and personally, because I look at what they did is they did 30 models, plotting 60,000 points along the globe. And then you could go to their website, which is actually not up anymore, unfortunately, and so I picked this site near McMinnville. The blue line represents historic temperature variability over time. The red line projects what if we did business as usual, more or less, and when that point of climate departure will occur. The orange color is a line for if we put efforts into keeping the temperature below 2 degrees C. And even with our best efforts at that, we'll see the climate pass this moment of threshold in 2044, which for me is brought home because I'm just maybe seen earlier, I'm an old fart. And frankly, I'm likely to be dead by then. But my kids, yeah, this always chokes me up. But my kids will be around to see this world that is completely different than the one that we've been living in. Oh, I gotta get it together here. Anyway, so there's been work done on emission inventory work around on the globe. And I just wanted to show this because the point was made in the hearing the other day that there's a significant amount of black carbon emissions from third world countries like China and India and Africa and Central America. And yes, that's true. But the point goes back earlier to that this is a regionalized pollutant. So it really is the amount of black carbon emissions from China does contribute to climate change, but the impact on processes in Oregon and North America are not, they're separate interactions. And so they're not tied to each other. The other thing I'd like to point out here, this is actually what's called the gross annual, as the title of the graph says, the gross annual black carbon emissions. So that accounts for all the emissions that come from these various activities, like what they call contained sources. So those are generally sources that have a controlled oxygen supply, high compression ratios and things like that, as opposed to an open burning where the mix of oxygen available is much more variable. And you can see what the distribution is. So in this analysis, then North America accounts for 6% of the total black carbon emissions, but that's not what's important, because if you look at what's actually creating the greatest impact to climate, you can see in this other graph that actually it's the contained sources that have the greatest impact on climate, whereas in fact, actually the forest burning, for instance, has a greater mix of cooling aerosols that actually controlling forest fires strictly on the basis of controlling black carbon, noting that there are other reasons why you may be concerned about wildfire emissions, is not the first step out of the box strategy for climate change, because you're actually reducing cooling aerosols at a greater rate than you're reducing warming aerosols. And the other point that I'll make about that too is that, like, for instance, Boardman this year stopped burning coal, which was actually great for climate because coal, as we know, puts out a lot of CO2. But remember that coal has an impact over many years' time. What's also in that coal is sulfur contamination. And the sulfur is emitted as a sulfate, which is a cooling aerosol. So perversely, what's happening with Boardman in terms of climate is that we stopped the emission of CO2, which is a great long-term strategy, but we've also removed the emission of sulfates, which actually will have, which those cooling aerosols will be disappearing. And so there's a near-term adverse impact to climate from reducing the CO2. This is a very complex issue. And I think it's really a problem when we address these things in a very simplistic way. We need to be looking at the whole picture. We need to be looking at science as we understand it today. This is an inventory with more detail. This was done by the US EPA. You can see here that most of the impacts are from transport sources. Primarily, this is diesel engines, but there is a gasoline contribution as well. You can see the biomass contribution at about 13% and residential biofuel at 15%. But again, this is the gross inventory. If we look at the net impact, again, the takeaway here is that it's the transport sector that is the largest contributor to black carbon and making it the most effective control strategy in terms of making any difference in terms of black carbon's contribution to climate change. And to make this point a little bit further, this is a project that I did when I was at DEQ. This is actually a Bernard Barge Lines, and I forget the name of it's a Catherine B. And that was a lovely project. It's a family-owned towboat company, and they have a running dispute with Shaver about who's been on the river the longest. How many? I don't know, close to 100 years or so. The family's been pushing material up and down the river. Anyway, so they were going to replace the engines. We had a grant from EPA. We're going to subsidize the replacement of the engines in this boat, and their attraction to being part of this project was that they get to save fuel because the engines, as the technology advanced over time, they're more fuel efficient. So by taking out the two engines, there's one of them down below in the right-hand corner, we would save the company 32,000 gallons of fuel, and that, of course, there's a load of carbon dioxide that comes from not burning from not burning that fuel. Well, we'd also be reducing 2.4 tons of diesel particulate matter, and that total climate change impact was actually distributed. Only 21% of the total benefit was from the CO2 reduction. 79% came from the reduction of the black carbon. So you can see it in projects like this, in terms of opportunities to have a benefit for climate, that addressing emissions from diesel engines can be a significant near-term strategy. And that's why we're looking at 2479, which directs DEQ to first amends the definition of greenhouse gases. We tried to get climate forces, but couldn't get them the Legislative Council to go that far in the language. So we have clunkily added black carbon to the list of other greenhouse gases. And by that, we're looking to have it be incorporated into climate policy going forward. The first step is for DEQ to actually inventory black carbon in Oregon, to focus, and we're going to be introducing an amendment that will focus on anthropogenic sources with the net harmful impact of global warming. That goes to that co-emitted aerosol issues, that we don't want to necessarily focus on strategies that will have maybe a mixed impact in terms of climate. And then so DEQ is also then to consider mitigation strategies, report to the EQC and the legislature, and then potentially include recommendations for legislation. So that's what I have to say on that. I don't know if there's anything more. Where are we at in time? The other bill that Rep. Power was talking about, 3305, renewable diesel is, God, how do I describe this? Biodiesel on steroids. Biodiesel is a fuel that comes from renewable feedstocks like canola, soybean oil, used cooking oil, things like that. And it's used in a transesterification process to turn into a fuel that can be blended with biodiesel. It has its own limitations from a user point of view. It gels at a higher temperature than diesel. It has some issues in terms of cold flow, impacts on seals, rubber seals in these older engines, and various other limitations. So generally, most engine manufacturers don't recommend blending more than 20%. Renewable diesel, on the other hand, uses the same feedstocks. Instead of running it through this transesterification process, they simply take it to an oil refinery and push it through the same protocol, the same hydrocracking process, and they come up with a fuel that is chemically identical to petroleum diesel, but of course has the sustainable benefits from having feedstock that came from contemporary carbon rather than from stored mined carbon. And the exciting thing, as we mentioned earlier, is that the current price with subsidies is identical to petroleum fuel. And what the bill's intended to do is to force development of a market in Oregon so that we can have that displaced petroleum fuel throughout the entire state. And I'm happy to answer any questions if we have any more time.
think we'll take questions all together at the end. Is
There we
that
go.
possible for you, Kevin, so that we can get through everything, and then if there are questions we can't take, we can always make sure to direct them to the individual speakers and make sure they get answered. So I'd like to introduce Amy Schlesser, who is the author of the original petition that was presented to the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission in December 2019. That was a petition to ask the state to use its authority to develop indirect source rule, go through rulemaking. And Amy is going to talk a little bit about the bill that is, because the petition was denied, despite we had 21 co-petitioners and 5 local governments, but the state at that time decided to deny the petition, but we've now gone to the legislature to ask the legislature to mandate the rulemaking process. So Amy is a great partner with the staff attorney at the Green Energy Institute, a brilliant woman and a passionate advocate in this field. And I'm really grateful and honored to be able to work with her on this. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, Kevin, too. That was amazing. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Mary. And the feeling is mutual. And yes, Kevin, that was fascinating. And I would love to touch base with you about some of the information you presented, which is really compelling and also quite honestly terrifying. So I'm Amy Schlesser. I'm a staff attorney with the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School. And I am going to talk a little bit about HB 2814, which is a bill that was introduced by Representatives Dr. Maxine Dexter and Con Pham. And it would direct the Environmental Quality Commission, or the EQC, to use its existing authority to control diesel emissions from indirect sources of air pollution that are currently either unregulated or inadequately regulated in Oregon. But before I explain what HB 2814 aims to do, I want to give just a little bit more context about what indirect source rules are and why they're important. And I know we're short on time, so I'll try to go quick. So bear with me if I'm talking really fast. Indirect sources are locations or facilities that attract mobile sources of air pollution. Mobile sources include on-road vehicles like diesel trucks and buses, as well as non-road vehicles and engines like construction equipment, locomotives, and marine vessels. Construction sites and distribution warehouses are common types of indirect sources. And intermodal freight facilities like rail yards and ports are also examples of indirect sources where there are a number of on-road and non-road engines operating within this single facility. Indirect source rules are one of the most powerful and flexible regulatory mechanisms for regulating diesel emissions because they allow states to control the aggregate emissions that are produced by all kinds of diesel vehicles and engines, including non-road equipment that states are otherwise preempted from regulating under the Clean Air Act. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the preemption issues in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about that if people have them. Indirect source rules are also a good mechanism for reducing diesel pollution in environmental justice communities because they can restrict emissions from all diesel vehicles and equipment that are operating at facilities located near communities that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution. And in Oregon, indirect source rules are particularly important because the state doesn't currently regulate emissions from the diesel vehicles and engines that are the largest contributors to Oregon's diesel pollution problem. At the same time, as Mary kind of alluded to earlier, California has adopted strict phase-out requirements for old diesel equipment and vehicles, and many of these vehicles are being sold into Oregon. So the problem here is only going to get worse the longer we wait to address it. HB 2814 represents a major step in the right direction. It would direct the EQC to adopt an indirect source review program to control the aggregate emissions from all on-road and non-road vehicles and engines that are associated with the construction and the operation of indirect sources. The bill would also require the owners or operators of indirect sources to notify surrounding communities of any significant air quality concerns that could impact local residents and businesses. It's also important to note that HB 2814 doesn't prescribe any specific emissions restrictions or specify how the program should operate. It simply directs the agency to adopt rules, which would then be crafted through Oregon's standard rulemaking process that enables stakeholders and community members to provide input on the rule's specific regulatory requirements. The legislature is also currently in the process of making some amendments to HB 2814 that would authorize DEQ to collect mitigation fees from sources that can't meet their on-site compliance obligations. And those fees would be deposited into a designated account to fund projects that reduce community exposure to air pollution from indirect sources. This provision would provide the agency with necessary resources and funding to pursue strategies that provide real meaningful benefits in communities that are currently disproportionately burdened by diesel pollution. And finally, I want to note that the House Committee on Energy and the Environment has scheduled a hearing on HB 2814 for 1 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. And I encourage anyone who supports this proposal to submit testimony in favor of the bill. You can provide either oral or written testimony. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. That was amazingly concise. I'm sure people have questions. And I just want to share the last bill that we're talking about today so that we can get to questions really fast. And I'm hoping, I actually, sorry, I'm the PowerPoint lady, but just gonna share really quickly the 2674, the clean, what I'm calling the Clean Diesel Business Investment Fund. I want to talk a little bit because, you know, the idea of, you know, us being able to get ahead of this diesel problem really is, we need to deal with the legacy of the diesel inventory in Oregon. And so the indirect source rule is really key. HB 2007 that was passed in 2019 was really key to start sending that market signal. But I think Kevin can attest to in his 18 years of specific diesel work in our state that one of the first, you know, barriers that we always run up against is we don't have the money. California has put hundreds of millions of dollars into this, and Washington State has also had public money to invest in cleaning up diesel engines, and that's what we need to do. So out of the background of this bill, 2674, was that HB 2007, besides for allocating the VW settlement money into a clean diesel engine fund, and besides for establishing some standards for in-use heavy-duty, medium-duty trucks, it also directed Section 19 to create a task force supporting business and reducing diesel emission task force. And the task force was told to figure out, identify public funding strategies to support businesses in transitioning to cleaner technology. Because most of this problem, a lot of people will say this is a problem that solves itself. New engine standards are incredibly clean. If you have a newer, as long as you don't have a fraud device put on them and the company cheated. But generally the standards of emissions for new engines post 2007, but certainly post 2010 are on the diesel PM issue are incredibly clean. And so the problem has been that the attrition rate in Oregon is slower than it is really, certainly for most of our neighbors. And as some have already alluded, because our neighbors are being more aggressive, we're taking in older equipment and our problem's getting worse more than it's getting better. And one thing that Kevin had always told me in his work with DEQ was, despite all the efforts he did to do clean diesel engine retrofits, getting federal money that was available, he couldn't keep up with the attrition rate, couldn't keep up. The problem was still getting worse, more than he could fix it, faster than he could fix it. So the money problem. So I'm sorry, I actually forgot to fill in. We met about 10 times over the course of 2020 in the task force. I was a member of the task force. It was chaired by first chair Deborah Kafoury from Multnomah County, and then when COVID and her duties at the county overtook, it became chaired by Commissioner Jayapal. And then we had bicameral, bipartisan legislative representatives and then stakeholders. And in 2020, we published a report in December 20, outlining the funding strategies that were available to us to feed the Clean Diesel Engine Fund. So HB 2674, and I want to make sure that you understand that it's -1 proposed amendments, because if you go on to HB 2674 and OLS, you'll see the placeholder bill that was put in pre-session in December that just says, we're going to study this problem. It is not that anymore. The -1 proposed amendments are very explicit to identify 4 new taxes that could be used to populate the Clean Diesel Engine Fund ongoing. So a tire tax, surcharge on the sale, rental, and lease of all off-road diesel equipment, which was something actually that Green Energy Institute brought to our attention that's been utilized in Texas. The privilege tax on new heavy-duty vehicles, that actually replicates very much what we do already on passenger vehicles to help support new technology infrastructure investment. And then finally, one that's near and dear to my heart is a tax on fuel tax on off-road diesel fuel, which is different than what diesel trucks use. And it really, this last one to me is the sweet spot of, you know, off-road engines are what causing the bulk of the problem. So it feels really proportionate to ask that there be a tax on the use of that to both incentivize a reduction in the use of that fuel, as well as it's sort of a polluter pays model. So this would put together $29.6 million annually. And it would also be something that we're really considering. I do think that if we started getting this kind of money and annual investment out to clean up diesel engines, and I think Kevin could just nod and say maybe yes, that if we were spending $30 million a year fixing the problem, we might accelerate the attrition rate to the point where this will be a problem that eventually could solve itself, but not without the money. So what Amy referred to, there is a public hearing both for 2814 and 2674 tomorrow in the House Energy and Environment Committee. It starts at 1 p.m. And I just want to talk people through really quickly the if you haven't gone on here, because I get questions a lot when we send a blast out, you can either just go on to olis.oregonlegislature.gov and look for committees, and you can see the date, and you can find the committee you're looking for. You can also look at the bills specifically. But then also when you go in to provide testimony, this came up from some people that we had directed today to provide testimony to these bills, make sure you choose a meeting date, because even if you get to choose a committee on energy environment, if you don't choose the meeting date, it says no bills or, there's nothing to comment on. So make sure you choose the meeting date that you're looking for. And that's just a very short, brief tutorial on some of the questions that came up just in the last couple of days from people that I wanted to make more clear to folks. But I do encourage submitting testimony in support of all these bills, and I want to give up the floor now and let us take some time for the question and answer session. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's been a really packed evening. This is being recorded, so you'll all get to see it again if you missed anything. And
I just muted Mary because her phone was going off. Sorry to end you right as you were talking, but I want to underscore what you were saying about the OLS. Like, that's a really important part that a lot of people struggle with. OLS is not very user friendly. So thanks for doing that little tutorial, Mary. And Kristen Teigen is gonna try and work through some. We're probably not gonna get to everyone's questions. But we will follow up with panelists if we did not get to your question. But we're going to try and skip around a little bit to get to some of the priority questions for everyone. And go ahead and take it away, Kristen.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to just address at the start, someone asked a question about, and thank you, Damon, for providing some clarity. Someone asked how long you can submit testimony, and testimony is accepted up to 24 hours after the initial hearing. So 1 p.m. on Thursday, you can submit testimony. So there are links in there. I just put, I think Damon put the link in there, and I had put the link in there about where to submit testimony. And I just put the link in there for the agenda. So there are a couple of other measures that are being discussed tomorrow, but the agenda will give you a sense of exactly when these pieces of legislation, 2818 and 2674, will be discussed tomorrow. So I'm going to just jump around. There have been a lot of people who have asked a lot of different questions, and so giving everyone a fair shot and a chance to take a breath. The first questions I'm going to ask, a couple of them are for Linda. Linda, I'm assuming you're still here. And the first one is looking at, this is from Diana Stewart. Looking at the hotspot map, it seems like the downtown core is bright red, ouch. Given that there is no EPA level monitoring in downtown, is it possible to do any additional monitoring there?
Yes, it's possible, but thanks for the question. But it wouldn't make sense to do it until we're back to normal behavior.
Mm.
So especially since Portland State's downtown, it would be relatively easy to do it. But I would want to wait until then.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And you have, Linda, done some monitoring that's covered in some of our past presentation materials, right? With construction specifically monitoring downtown already, right?
Yeah, we were looking at specific sources, but just to get and we have some data for just the average levels downtown, but we haven't done any longer term monitoring like we did with the other two sites.
Thanks.
Downtown.
Great. And then, you know, with the caveat that this would be something that would take place after the world opens back up again, there's a question for either Mary or for Linda from Kevin saying, given the rise of hobbyist air quality devices like Purple Air monitors, is there an optimum density for these types of devices when measuring air quality within an area? For example, in the downtown area, what would be really the best?
So I'll save Linda a little bit from this, from the, but we are working, we are trying to figure that out, and we're working with her colleague that she mentioned when she introduced the research, this EPA funded research, Dr. Julie Fry, on this Purple Air network. And, you know, Julie's working on doing some of the data analysis and trying to figure out how to make sure that low cost sensors and the information we're getting from the low cost sensors, we can integrate it with a bigger understanding of the air quality issues, the other data sets that we have. So I'm not sure that, you know, we need more than less. So density of the number of sensors is something that Julie has said it would be helpful, especially in areas. I mean, one of the areas we're really looking at is some of the places where Linda's done community monitor, you know, East Multnomah County and Cully, but we're still kind of figuring that out. So I will say that Dr. Julie Fry is trying to work out some of that in terms of finding what that optimum number is for us, especially as we try and continue to invest in this program. But Linda, I don't know if you had, you know, if you want to speak to that more specifically.
Well, I just want to make sure everybody understands that the Purple Air monitors measure particulate matter in general, so, and not diesel particulate matter specifically. So, you know, generally speaking, diesel particulate matter is around 4% in urban areas of PM 2.5. So when you're looking at the Purple Air data, you're not really seeing diesel. And then, you know, it depends on what you're looking for in terms of your monitor spacing. You know, generally PM 2.5 doesn't have huge gradients unless you're right next to a source. So it depends what you're looking for in terms of that density of monitors, which I answered Kevin privately.
Oh, okay. Great, thank you so much. I'm going to skip over to Kevin. There are a couple of specific questions for you, Kevin. The first one is about what is the chemical, you were sort of joking about scientists, but what is the chemical makeup of black carbon, if you happen to know that?
So actually, I think it's actually just carbon. is, and I don't know if Dr. George might have a better, she's nodding her head up and down. So it's simplified carbon is what we're talking about here. And it goes to that first picture I had was, of course, is a
Yeah.
chimney sweep. And people have known since, well, when people were sweeping chimneys, that carbon results in increased risk for cancer, which was a job defect with chimney sweepers. So it's the astonishing thing about this work is that it's not just an occupational hazard. So this is not just for truck drivers or locomotive engineers or things like that. It's at levels that all of us are breathing every day that we see a resulting high risk for cancer and a multitude of other health effects.
Great. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, I don't know if Dr. George would want to chime in.
Yeah,
with anything
exactly.
else, but I mean, I know from my non-scientific perspective that it's basically about what, like when you burn fossil fuels, it's all of the stuff that's the incomplete combustion. That's the results of that. Is that true, Dr. George?
Well, yeah, the black carbon particles are the product of that incomplete combustion. And as I mentioned, I mean, it's a very small fraction of it, but those gases that condense onto that surface, that's what that lends the toxicity of those black carbon. And I think some of the PAHs is actually what's on that soot that creates the toxicity for chimney sweeps.
Which is, you had
It's benzopyrene, actually, yeah.
at the beginning of your presentation, you had that sort of atomic cannonball that you
Right.
showed. So if anybody missed that, we'll send the recorded version out so you can look at that too. Thanks, Kristen.
Great. And so, Kevin, hopefully you're okay with another one. Emily Herbert asks, does the DEQ have funds to track black carbon and make recommended changes?
The answer
Dr.
is
Funding.
the answer is kind of. So we'll see. We've been negotiating with DEQ about the bill. They're very interested in the work, and they're concerned about the scale of fiscal impact, which is always kind of like anathema in the legislative process. The good news is that the department already collects data on particulate matter as a matter of course. They report every 3 years on the level of emissions for a variety of standard pollutants in Oregon, of which particulates are part of that, and black carbon is a subset of that. And so, but the challenge that they're going to face in this is they've never had to break out black carbon from the total suite of particulate emissions, as well as the cooling aerosols as well, which is actually a part of that calculation that I described about focusing on those strategies that will have the greatest benefit for climate. The one observation I'll make is that all the historic pollutants that have been regulated under the Clean Air Act, well, not all, but 99% of them are ozone and carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxide, all of which have the hallmark of being chemically identified, whereas particulate matter is not. Particulate matter is identified by its aerosol size. So if it's very, very small, it counts as particulate. And that particulate can be a host of variety of different chemicals. And each of those chemicals have different adverse or maybe even positive impacts on human health or the environment. And so we've never really had to tease that out at that scale before. Again, highlighting that what we're doing here is bringing increased complexity, but reality as well to our ability to understand what's happening in the atmosphere, and which also directly affects our ability to make a positive impact on whatever outcome we're looking for.
Great, thank you so much. We're kind of running low on time, so I'm going to ask one more question, and this is of Mary, or to Mary, about, are there any talking bills for testimony tomorrow, or talking points? I'm so sorry, talking bills.
There are, and we have some documents that I can share. I think I saw that came from Akash, no surprise, the detail man, but I'm sure that other folks would appreciate that. And we could send our follow-up email with some document links to the basic overviews of the bills, if that's helpful to folks. So I'll make sure that Kristen has those and can attach them to our follow-up email. So thank you for asking. And yes, we do have some basic talking points for folks.
Great. And so there are a couple more questions, but we are getting low on time. And so the additional questions, I think Mary mentioned that we will be very happy to send along to the people they're asked of. And I'm going to hand it back to Mary.
Well, thank you everyone, as usual, for the time. Thank you so much, Dr. George, Kevin Downing, who I hope everybody saw the chat because I didn't do a very good job of introducing Kevin. I just think he's a diesel guy, but he spent 25 years at DEQ and 18 years working on diesel. He is a preeminent expert on the issue in Oregon. And
it's still a problem.
So. Well, and then Amy Schlesser, as I said, one of the brilliant attorneys that so honored to get to work with on identifying the policy pathways. But I always say this, and I hope you know it's so true. It really is about all of you. So I'm hoping that we've conveyed this information in a way that you can understand it. You showed up because this matters to you. You're concerned about it. We have a lot of partner organizations on, who've also participated in this. And I'm so grateful for like Oregon PSR and Opal, and we've worked with Verde, and all of you at the community level who are leaders in your communities and been working on this very significantly. So we're hoping that what we're providing you is more ammunition to strengthen your testimony. And it's really about you using that option and showing up when these legislative opportunities show up and otherwise. But right now we've got a legislature that is actually pretty engaged on this issue, and they really need to hear from you and know that it's important to you as well. So anything that we can do, any clarification, any way that we can help you strengthen your testimonies and submission of comments, we're happy to be at your service. All of us at NCA are basically Mary at neighborsforcleanair.org, Kristen at neighborsforcleanair.org, Tori at neighborsforcleanair.org. So please reach out if you need anything from us, and go forth and testify. Thank you everyone for your commitment to this.
Thanks, Mary.